Good morning. It's great to be with you here this morning. Always a blessing to be able to come and worship with you. And even though I was planning to be here for Sabbath school, unfortunately I was unable to be here. I ran into some traffic on the way here, but still blessed to be able to join you for the worship service itself. And thank you so much for those of you who have helped lead out. Joseph, that was beautiful. Thank you so much for leading us in that. And Beth for leading us in singing and just being able to reflect on the goodness of God and where do we turn when times are tough? Where do we turn? Do we turn to God or do we turn somewhere else? And just a blessing to be able to meditate on that together this morning. Unfortunately, Pastor Don was supposed to be able to be here today and preach for you this morning, but he had something come up and was unable to make it, so keep him in your thoughts and prayers. But it's my privilege this morning to be able to step in, to be able to share a little bit of the word with you this morning. So we're actually going through a series on the life of David. But before we get to that, I have a quick question. How many of you guys remember the year 2020? A few of you are old enough to remember. And for those of you who aren't old enough to remember, it's always great to have young people here, so that's awesome. But 2020, of course, was a kind of a big year. There was a presidential election, so there's a lot of turmoil and uncertainty surrounded that. Some of you remember some of the unfortunate things that caused protests around the country. Some of you might remember a little thing called COVID, may or may not. It kind of happened. For me, all those things have obviously affected me as well as everyone else here. But for me, there was a couple things, especially I remember fondly about the year 2020, despite kind of all the other stuff going on. The first was I met my girlfriend, now fiance, and so that was all exciting. We started dating back then. The other thing, as a sports fan, I grew up in Missouri, and so for those of you who watched the Super Bowl that year, that was the year that the Kansas City Chiefs, my home team that I grew up rooting for, finally made the Super Bowl and played against the San Francisco 49ers. And I was really excited about it, and then the game started. And it was not going so great, and the 49ers were just outplaying us, my team, the Chiefs, consistently, and the Chiefs kept falling further behind and finally got to this point where it's late in the fourth quarter, 9 minutes to go in the game, and the Chiefs are down 20-10. The 49ers have the Chiefs pinned. It's third and long, and it's this moment of desperation for the Chiefs. What do they do? The question they have to ask is, how do we respond? And so as we get ready to go into our sermon today about the life of David, we're actually doing this story a little bit out of order because the sermon I wanted to preach next here I felt was fit better for Pathfinder Sabbath, which I'm preaching for in a couple weeks, so make sure you come, support the Pathfinders, be a part of that blessing. You'll receive that Sabbath. So we're doing this story that happens actually chronologically after that next story, but it tends to just kind of fit this theme that we're going through with the life of David. David, the reason we're studying David is because David is a type of the Messiah, a type of this chosen one. He's pointing us forward, though, to the ultimate chosen one, the ultimate Messiah, who's Jesus. And the question that the gospel asks constantly about Jesus is, how do you respond? And so this morning we're going to ask that question by looking at the end of Saul's life, kind of the story that goes along with David of how do you respond in life when things get desperate. And so this morning I've got some bad news for you, for those of you who are type A personalities, that you can't control everything. I know some of us are tempted to think that. We oftentimes wish we could control everything. We wish we could just make our spouse do exactly what she or he would do. We wish we could make our kids just always make responsible, healthy decisions for their lives. We wish we could even control ourselves sometimes. Some of us lack a little bit of self-control in that sometimes. We wish we could control the weather. We wish we could control other drivers. We wish we could control the way our boss interacted with us, the way our employees reacted to us, the way our customers were. We wish that other drivers would just always stay in their lane and not cut me off. I wish that I could have controlled the timing of when South Bend decided to do road work this morning. That would have been much more convenient. There's so many things we wish we could control in life. And while it's important to take responsibility for our actions, and while part of becoming wise is learning the cause and effect and how they relate to each other, the truth is some things in our life are just not in our control. Or as one author in the Bible, Solomon, puts it, time and chance happen to us all. And so no matter who we are, no matter where we come from, no matter where we've been or where we're going, all of us come to these moments in life that are outside our control, where we have no idea what to do. We have no idea how things could possibly turn out for the good. And we're forced to answer the question, now what? How do I respond to this? And this morning, we're going to look at the tragic end of the life of Saul, and we're going to see how he responds in this moment of desperation. Even though this is a story of desperation and eventual hopelessness, there's still the gospel message embedded within this story. There is still hope for us, even if Saul ultimately does not find the hope that he possibly could have had. So if you want to follow along, this story is in 1 Samuel chapter 28. We'll start in verse 4. 1 Samuel 28 verse 4 says, "Then the Philistines gathered together and came and encamped at Shunem. So Saul gathered all Israel together, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dream or by the Urim or by the prophets." Saul is in this moment of desperation. The Philistines, the sworn enemies of Israel, are preparing to attack. Israel's armies are weaker than the Philistines, partially because Saul has been hunting David down, and David, out of his own moment of desperation, has gone and hidden with the Philistines. So Saul's worried that maybe David is turning against him now. That's not what happens, but Saul's worried that that's a possibility. Saul is worried that, I don't know what to do. This army is larger, it's stronger, it's better trained, better equipped right now than my own army. And when Saul turns to God to ask for God, God is silent. God does not respond to Saul. And this is a tough verse. The idea that Saul inquires of the Lord, but it says the Lord did not answer him. That's hard for us as Christians to understand. That challenges the way we view God, doesn't it? Because we have this idea that if I ask God has to respond. He has to hear me. He has to do things. We want to control God sometimes. And it's tempting to think that, well, this verse must just be wrong. God, obviously, God would answer Saul. And that it's so important in our lives. All of us come to the scripture with our own ideas, our own biases, our own background, the way we wish the Bible said, the way we wish God worked. But our job as Christians isn't to try to force the Bible to say what we think it should say, but it's rather to submit what we think to what the Bible has to say. And so why then do we have to wrestle with this question? Why did the Lord refuse to answer Saul? Why is he ignoring Saul? One author writes about this. She says, "Why did the Lord turn Saul away unanswered? Because Saul had rejected Samuel the prophet. He had exiled David, the chosen one of God. Saul had slain the priests of the Lord. He had cut off every channel of communication that heaven had given him. And now Saul, in his moment of desperation, did not turn to God with humility and repentance." So it's not that God's rejecting Saul because God just woke up one day and felt like he was in a bad mood and I'm just not dealing with this guy today. That's not what's happening here. But rather, God has given Saul many, many opportunities to listen to God, to communicate with God. And Saul has systematically destroyed every single opportunity God's given him to communicate. And even now, in his moment of desperation, Saul isn't turning humbly to God, but Saul is demanding of God that God answer him. And that is not the type of God that we can't demand of God what he's going to do, but rather we must humbly come to God and seek God and humbly submit ourselves to him when we're in need. I'm so sorry. Had an alarm set for you, so let me just double check, make sure I don't have any other alarms on my phone. I am so sorry, folks. All right, there we go. So Saul does not turn to God in this moment of desperation, or he tries to, but he doesn't do it humbly, and so God is not responding. So what does Saul do next? This is a desperate moment. He has this problem that's not going away, and God's not answering Saul the way that Saul wants him to answer because Saul's not willing to come to God the way that he needs to. So we find in verse 8 that Saul disguised himself and put on other clothes, and he went and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night. And he said, "Please conduct a seance for me, and bring up for me the one I shall name to you." Then the woman said to him, "Look, you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the spirits from the land. Why then do you lay a snare for me to cause me to die?" And Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, "As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." Saul goes to a witch. If God's not answering, maybe the devil will. That's the way that Saul's thinking here. Like, I need something more powerful than me. I don't care what it is. And that's how we know that Saul's not going to God humbly, because Saul's not really about following God. He's not really about submitting his life to God in this moment of desperation. Saul is just trying to manipulate some higher power into doing his work for him. And so Saul goes to a witch, and the witch is afraid because she's suspecting that Saul has come to kill her, at the very least arrest her, because Saul, early in his reign, knew how terrible these witches, these people who practiced this dark magic and this seances and all this other stuff, he knew how dangerous that was, how evil that was. And so Saul had banned them from the land. And so this witch is scared that this is a trap. And so the witch is actually telling Saul, no, like, don't make me do this. And that's a huge problem when even a witch is telling you, no, you're going too far. But yet Saul is desperate, and so he's turning to this witch in this moment of desperation. Saul asks her, "Bring up the spirit of Samuel from the grave." And the witch obliges. In verse 15, Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me, bringing me up from the grave?" And Saul answered, "I am deeply distressed, for the Philistines make war against me. The Lord has departed from me and does not answer me anymore, neither by prophets nor by dreams. Therefore I have called you, that you may reveal to me what I should do." Then Samuel said, "Why do you ask me, seeing the Lord has departed from you and has become your enemy? And the Lord has done for himself as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom away from your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord, nor execute his fierce wrath upon Amalek. Therefore, the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel into your hand, with you into the hand of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons will be with me in the grave. The Lord also will deliver the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines." Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground and was dreadfully afraid because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had eaten no food all day or all night. Saul tells this spirit of Samuel his problems and asks what he should do. And he's told, Samuel reminds Saul of all his mistakes. He just lists them all up. Boom, boom, boom. Here's all the ways you failed. He reminds him of his mistakes. He reminds him of all the ways that he has done wrong, that he hasn't done what God's commanded him. And then Samuel tells Saul that he will die tomorrow. This is a hopeless situation. Saul, turning to this witch in this moment of desperation, goes from desperate to completely hopeless. There's no hope for him anymore. Saul loses the last little bit of his courage and faints. Looking ahead, skipping ahead a little bit to verse 24. Now the woman had a fatted calf in the house, and she hastened to kill it. And she took flour and made it into bread and baked it. So she brought it before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they rose and went away that night. So Saul, the first king of Israel, the one who God chose to be the first king of Israel, the one that God had such high hopes for, such incredible plans for what Saul's life could have been, Saul spends his final night on earth eating witches' food. He could have turned to God. He could have humbly repented, but no, instead of going to God and eating from the bread of life, Saul eats the bread of a witch. And this is a hopeless, terrible, tragic end. And jumping forward to 1 Samuel 31, in case you're wondering what skipped in 29:30, it goes back to what's happening with David for a couple chapters before it concludes Saul's story. It says, "Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. Then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons. And the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchijah, Saul's 3 oldest sons. The battle became fierce against Saul. The archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, 'Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and abuse me.' But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it." Saul loses his final battle, his final time of leading Israel into battle against the Philistines, and Saul loses. Israel's routed. This is a terrible, terrible day. Not only is Saul killed, but his 3 oldest sons, including Jonathan, the crown prince. It's a terrible ending, and Saul ultimately ends his life in the most tragic of ways by committing suicide. This is a tragic story. This is a story that goes from desperate to hopeless for Saul. So going back to our earlier story with the Super Bowl, the Chiefs were down 20-10 late in the game. I remember the night before I'd called my brother. We were both really excited because this is our team in the Super Bowl. And we were talking, it's like, hey, even I feel like the 49ers are the better team. And I remember telling him, you know what, but we have Patrick Mahomes. He's the best player in football right now. And we just, even if we're down late, we just need him to play at his best for a few minutes and we can erase any lead. And that's exactly what happened. The Chiefs scored 3 touchdowns in a row, and a 10-point loss became an 11-point win. The final 9 minutes of the game surpassed what happened in the first 51 minutes of the game. Those last few minutes weighed more than the rest of the game combined. And so, as we look at this story about Saul, you're like, where's the hope within this story? How is the gospel message in this hopeless story about this man who ends his life in the most tragic of ways? The Witch of Endor and Saul's final story is a cautionary tale, yes, about the dangers and evils of getting involved with witches and spiritualism and black magic and all the stuff that goes along with that. But it's also the gospel embedded within the story. So, turning to 1 Chronicles chapter 10, the verse that was read for us this morning, thank you so much for doing that. This is where the gospel is, and it might not be obvious at first, but it's here, I promise you. 1 Chronicles 10, verses 13 and 14, Chronicles retells the story of Saul and David, and it retells the story of Saul's final. And it has this to say about the end of Saul's life. "So Saul died for his unfaithfulness, which he had committed against the Lord, because he did not keep the word of the Lord, and also because he consulted a medium for guidance. But he did not inquire of the Lord. Therefore he killed him and turned the kingdom over to David the son of Jesse. So this is reminding us, like, hey, Saul is not actually the one we're looking for. The whole story of the Bible, we're looking for this Messiah. We're looking for this one person who can be the righteous leader who makes everything right, the chosen one of God who's going to fix all the evils in the world. And this reminds us that Saul is not that person. But even for Saul, there's this hope, or there was this hope, rather. Because Chronicles here lists 2 reasons why Saul dies. Number 1, not keeping the word of the Lord. This was all of the sins of Saul's life. Everything that Saul did wrong in his entire life would fall under that category of not keeping the word of the Lord. All of Saul's sins fall into that first half of why he died, tragically. The other reason is because he turned to the witch instead of to the Lord. So on the one hand, you have all the mistakes of Saul's life, all of the bad things he did falls under that first category. And then equal to that is this one decision at the end of his life. This one decision to turn to the witch instead of humbly repenting to the Lord. And so therein lies the gospel, because that implies that if that one final mistake equaled all the previous mistakes put together, that implies that if Saul had done that one final thing right, if at the end of his life Saul had humbled himself and repented, that one right decision would have equaled all of his previous sins. God's grace would have equaled, God's forgiveness would have equaled, and God's grace would have even surpassed all of Saul's previous sins. And Saul would have been saved. The Lord would have given Saul redemption and grace at the end of his life. That reminds me of just one final story I want to share before we close. It's a man whose story is told in the New Testament briefly, and it is a brief story. It's only a few verses long. In fact, it's such a small, short story that we don't even know the man's name. Different traditions have given him different possible names, kind of guessed at what it might have been. Some people call him Dismas or Dimas, Titus or Rock, or some of the more common names. We don't know the origins of his life. We don't know if he was poor and desperate, whether he was well off and he's the black sheep of the family who just kind of chose this life of crime. We don't know if he was a criminal because this was the family trade and he's part of some sort of mafia type of thing. We have no idea about the thief on the cross and who he is or his origins. We don't know what his attitudes have been throughout his life about this life of crime. We don't know if he enjoyed it and he liked all of the stuff that came with it. Or we don't know, maybe he felt trapped. Maybe he was desperate and he felt this was the only way to feed himself and his family. We have no idea. All we know is that he was a thief who had been caught, and now to make an example of him, he's being hung on a cross. This is a moment of desperation for him. And how does this man respond? And found in Luke chapter 23, verse 39. Then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." So one of the criminals, that's his response, this moment of desperation, is one final time cursing God, mocking God, and just screw you, that mindset. One final defiant raised fist as he goes down to the grave. But the other thief, his response is different. But the other answered, rebuked him, saying, "Do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. But this man, he has done nothing wrong." Then he said to Jesus, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said, "Assuredly I say to you today, you will be with me in paradise." Wow. This final moment, this thief humbly repents of his sins. In this moment of desperation, there's nowhere for him to run. There's nowhere for him to hide. His sins, his naked body exposed to the world. And in this moment of desperation, he turns to Jesus. In this final moments of desperation, he asks for forgiveness, for Jesus to remember him. He admits his wrong, which is what humbly repenting means, to admit that I'm wrong, that I'm mistaken. And so in this one final moment, the grace of God surpasses all of the thief's previous sins. So when it comes to your life in these moments of desperation that we face sometimes, what will you do? Are you going to be like Saul and you turn to this witch? You turn to someone other than God. You're just desperate for someone to solve your problems on your terms. When Saul does that, his moment of desperation goes from desperate to hopeless. On the other hand, the thief in his moment of desperation, he turns to Jesus, the greatest man to ever live, God himself, and he has eternal life promised to him. He gets to live in paradise with God himself. So in our lives, no matter the desperation that we face, one decision to turn to God in that moment of desperation will equal and surpass all our previous mistakes. No situation in your life is ever too big for the forgiveness and grace of God to equal and surpass everything else.